Good morning. It's 10 o'clock in Santiago de Chile. Welcome. My name is Karen Poniachik. I am Director of Columbia University's Global Center here in Chile. I am delighted that we can co-host this event today with our colleagues in the Columbia Global Center of Rio de Janeiro, led by Tom Trebat, and with the Universidad Católica's Center for International Studies, led by our colleague and good friend Jorge Saad, who will participate in today's conversation with Professor Andrew Nathan. He's one of the most renowned, topmost scholars on US-China relations. And this discussion, this conversation happens at a time in which relations between the US and China are probably at their lowest point in 48 years. Andrew's teaching and research interests include Chinese politics and Chinese foreign policy. He's written dozens of articles and published almost 15 books, including China's Search for Security with Andrew Scoble, The Great Wall and the Empty Fortress with Robert Ross, and Human Rights in Contemporary China, among many. Many experts, including Andrew in a recent article, are talking about a new Cold War. The Financial Times even created a section with that title to include news and analysis on this topic. And he will speak for about 15 minutes maybe on some of the issues he covers in a recent piece entitled The Heart of the New Cold War, which we're going to post in our website. And then we will follow up in a conversation with Jorge Saad. And you can send your questions via the chat room. And we're very much looking forward to this event today. Andy, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizations that are hosting this. I'm really pleased to be speaking to an audience in Chile, and I understand there are a lot of Columbia alums there. So that's great. Good to see you. Please come back after the COVID crisis and visit us. Well, we're going to focus on the future of US-China relations after the election, but in order to understand it, I think we have to reach back a bit into the past briefly. So the thing to understand about the People's Republic of China since 1949 is that it has been a country with very shaky security. China has been an insecure country. And that, although we think of China today as a sort of behemoth, that it's very strong and it's spreading its tentacles all over the world and so forth, actually, I think it's better to understand China as a country that is still doesn't feel secure. Insecurity, threat, vulnerability, that's the theme, I think, that we need to use to understand China's international behavior. What is this vulnerability that I'm talking about? Well, it has many dimensions. First of all, it has an internal or domestic dimension. You have about 94% of the population who are ethnic Han, or, as we think of as Chinese, who have been through an incredibly disruptive social change during the reform period since the death of Mao, moving into the cities, moving into apartments, being exposed to globalization, traveling overseas, buying an automobile, being subjected to the one-child policy, having an expansion of college-level education, and so on and so forth. So that huge population has gone through tremendous change and they're not disloyal to the government, but it's not a stable sociological situation or psychological situation. There are many people who are dissatisfied, who are participating in Catholicism and Protestantism and new religions and so on and so forth, and others who want more of what they already have, want more prosperity. So that's a problem. And then, secondly, still within the borders of China, you have large and strategically important territories like Xinjiang and Tibet that are populated by populations that are not really happy for various reasons. They're not necessarily armed terrorists or anything like that, but they are not under control either. And Hong Kong has not been under their control, and Taiwan has not been under their control. So it's not a country with a stable political scene domestically. Then as they look beyond their borders, they're surrounded by other countries that don't really like China. It's not like the United States, which is surrounded by countries that belong in essence to the same culture and have a certain common value system. China is surrounded by Russia, by India, by Japan, by Vietnam, and so on, and about 24 different countries that don't really trust China. Then, as they look beyond that at the global system, the Chinese economy is dependent on imports of oil, of iron, of copper, of beef, of soybeans. It's very dependent, and it's dependent on markets as well. So and that broader world scene has been controlled by the United States and its allies. And so we have the capability to really damage China if we want to do so. But of course, as you know, in the reform period and since the early 1990s in particular, China has maneuvered itself very wisely and has been able to take advantage of the global economy to enjoy vast economic growth. And as they've done that, they've worked to improve their security position in all of these aspects. And China has quite a bit of money now. And Xi Jinping, the leader of China who came to power in 2012, has been pushing very hard to further improve China's security situation. And the things that he has done have alarmed the United States and have begun to alarm quite a few other countries as well. The Europeans, the Australians, and so on and so forth have begun to be alarmed by Xi Jinping's policies. Policies like building the 7 sand islands in the South China Sea, policies like cracking down in Xinjiang, cracking down in Hong Kong, and cracking down on lawyers and feminists and religious communities inside of China, policies like the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, policies like what some people have called sharp power of denying visas and trying to control foreign journalists and things of this kind. Many people characterize Xi Jinping's policy as aggressive. I think that's probably the wrong idea. Xi Jinping is not trying to seize the territory of Korea, Vietnam, Siberia. He is certainly prosecuting vigorously China's existing territorial claims that have been there for a long time. They have territorial disputes with India, with Vietnam, and so forth. So they're not giving anything up, but they're not expanding their claims. It's not like making new claims. So the rise of China then has reached a phase in which China is taking advantage of the money that it has to build up its military power and to improve its economic security, which is probably what any country would do if it faced so many vulnerabilities and began to have the resources to do a lot more. So that's, I think, the background of the trouble that has broken out in US-China relations. When the United States looks at this Chinese behavior, American policymakers were surprised. They probably shouldn't have been surprised because the logic that I just described is kind of IR 101. It's what any country would do if it had the resources. But US policy, as you know, for a long time was based on the idea that as China became wealthier, it would actually become more friendly to the United States. That has proven to be a false expectation. So as China seeks to improve their own security, building up their military, building up their global influence, it of course creates friction with the position that the United States has inherited from the end of World War II. So starting with the end of World War II, the United States enjoyed a period of dominance in the Asia-Pacific region, military dominance and diplomatic dominance, and especially after the Sino-Soviet split and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had this period of time when the United States was the so-called sole superpower, and that's changing. China is now what we call a peer competitor. It doesn't have the same GDP as the United States. It doesn't have a military that's configured in the same way as the United States. It's not exactly a carbon copy of the United States, but it can compete with American power and probably check American military power in the Asia-Pacific region, where the two militaries confront each other the most, because the Chinese military is basically regional at this point in that region. So the United States sees that its incumbent position, its inherited position, is threatened. It doesn't like it. And so that is sort of a big picture for friction between the two powers. And then third, if you bring in the particular features of the Trump administration, then that begins to explain the way in which this US-China friction has developed. The Trump administration came to power on top of a sort of populist reaction against globalization. It looked around for enemies to show that it was tough, that it was defending the interests of the United States, and China was the obvious enemy. And the Trump administration has exaggerated the Chinese threat. There is that discourse. There has been a lively debate in the United States and Europe about the Chinese threat. How big is it, and exactly what does it consist of? Some people say China wants to take over the world. Some people say China wants to undermine the liberal international order, and so on. So there are those people who have a very scary picture of what China intends to do, and then there are others who say no, China just wants to have its due place in the existing international order. But the politics of Trumpian populism require a sort of simple story, which is that China is a huge threat. And if you speak to them about what is exactly the threat, it's hard to get the details because they don't think of it in that way, but they've configured it as a values threat. It's a threat to the American way of life, or to the Western value system. So, as you probably know, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has kind of seized control over China policy. There's been a big battle inside of the Trump administration over China policy. And I probably should save any discussion of that for the discussion period, so I don't use up all the time in the presentation. But there's been this battle, but Pompeo has kind of come out on top of China policy, and he's organized a series of speeches by other policymakers, ending up with a speech of his own, saying that China threatens fundamental Western values. Now, as a China scholar myself, I don't exactly see how that works. I understand that the Chinese government definitely does itself adhere to values that are different from Western democratic rule of law values, but how they're going to expand, destroy our values and sort of take over the United States and the West, that part of it is not, I think, doesn't make sense. And it's not clear to me what the Pompeo vision would be, but it's just a very scary vision of the Chinese. I think there's an element there of white supremacy. There's an element of defense of Christianity. I think there's a lot of messages in this fear of China that are connected to the idea of white Christian civilization has to be defended because the colored people of the world are rising up. But they don't never say it like that. But I think that's what underlies it. So I think that no matter who wins the election, this confrontation or competition, whatever you want to call it, between China and the United States is going to continue. First, because of the big structural reason that I mentioned, is that the rise of China does challenge the incumbent American position in the Asia Pacific and in UN institutions and in the global economy. And secondly, because of the domestic politics of the situation actually in both countries. Because in China too, as part of this interaction, there's a increasing sense that the United States is hostile to the legitimate interests of the Chinese people. And in the United States, it's no longer really possible to get away with, being a panda hugger. No politician is a panda hugger now. So the issue is, how do we deal with the challenge of China? I have, in this article that you mentioned, I have pointed out that the US-China competition, although it's being labeled a new Cold War, is not really the same as the old Cold War. In the old Cold War, the Soviet Union had a complete ideology that they wanted to promote and have other countries adopt that would have constructed a completely different domestic system for all countries and a completely different international order. China doesn't have that. They have their own system for their own country. They're not really trying to create a universal ideology or change the domestic political systems of other countries. If you're a democracy, they're happy to work with you. If you're a dictatorship, they're happy to work with you. They just want you to respect their Taiwan policy and for you to accept loans from them and to sell them your raw materials. They're happy to work with anybody. Secondly, the Soviet Union had a whole alliance system and confronted the West on the land mass of Europe. China doesn't have any military allies. It has one treaty with North Korea, but I mean, it has nobody to help it militarily, and it really isn't challenging anybody on the land borders. And there is a dispute on the sea in the South China Sea, and there's the Taiwan issue, but it's a different military confrontation from the old Cold War. And then also the two systems are so interdependent, China and the United States, or China and the West economically. There are so many positives in that relationship, as well as the competition side and the new problems that we face, including pandemics and climate change, just simply cannot be solved without cooperation. Those situations didn't exist in the old Cold War. So it's going to be different, but it's still going to be bad. It's still a bad situation. And it has to be managed. If Biden is elected, Biden is surrounded by very sophisticated Asia experts. And his policy will be some kind of toughened up version of the Obama policy. The Obama policy was the so-called pivot to Asia. That meant that the United States would strengthen its military position in Asia to a certain extent to try to send a message to China that don't try to drive us out of Asia, don't try to seize Taiwan. The Obama policy included the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an effort to gather free market economies together to enhance their trade and create something that would incentivize China to change their economic system. The Chinese are not going to change their economic system because we pressure them and denounce them, because their economic system works for them. But if we can offer them benefits from economic reform. That was the idea there. So a Biden administration will be, be tough on China, and also will do multilateralism. It would understand that in order to effectively constrain China, we need to work with allies. Human rights will, I think, occupy a more consistent and important position in the Obama policy, because one of the things that has emerged from the Trump administration is this idea that the competition is a clash of value systems, and I think that idea will continue. If Trump is reelected, it's a little bit hard to predict, because Trump himself is very non-strategic and inconsistent. And so he could conceivably say, okay, my greatness has been confirmed by this election, and I'm sort of equal to Xi Jinping in my control of domestic politics, and the two of us can get together and settle everything. If he tries that, it won't work, but he could try it. But I think more likely is that the Pompeo stream of China threat ideology will continue to animate a second Trump administration, and they will try to exacerbate the conflict between the two sides, for example, around Taiwan, by strengthening US relations with Taiwan. And in my assessment, that type of policy will be very dangerous, because, to go back to the beginning of my talk, Chinese policymakers see China's security as threatened. So let's take, just as an example, Taiwan. If in a second Trump administration, the United States decides to recognize Taiwan, or to go halfway and significantly increase our defense commitment to Taiwan, and there are people now arguing that the United States should eliminate any ambiguity about our defense commitment to Taiwan. If they do that, the Chinese will read that as a threat to their security, to their national existence. And I can explain why they take Taiwan so seriously in the Q&A if we want to talk about it. And they absolutely will not back down in that case. Instead, they will redouble their pressure on Taiwan. And so that kind of thing, exacerbating the conflict, could lead to very tragic consequences, but that's what I think is most likely to happen under a Trump administration. So let me leave it there and get into the dialogue part of the program.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much, Andy. There's lots of topics that you raised. I'm going to turn it over to Jorge. Maybe you want to start, Jorge?
Hey, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Karen. Andrew, in your article, you mentioned, as you said, difference between this new Cold War and the original one. One of them is the interdependence or codependence between China and US on trade, investment, even educational challenge. In this time of strategic confrontation between US and China, but at the same time, this high level of interdependence, how do you see the risk of decoupling between both countries, only in the tech sector, or also on trade, global supply chains, etc.?
So I think the tech sector is the one is going to become decoupled. Let me clarify, because those concepts are very ambiguous. By tech sector and decoupling, what do we mean? So I think, for example, the manufacturing of iPhones in China, that would continue. But when I speak about the tech sector, I'm speaking about anything with security implications and privacy implications. So that involves software, it involves the export of Chinese equipment. Well, this has really already happened, that kind of decoupling, the export of Huawei and ZTE equipment into Western 5G networks, anything that has a security, the development of artificial intelligence, the development of standards for future telecoms. those things, I think, are inevitably going to become decoupled on both sides because neither side trusts the other. The Chinese distrust us as much as we distrust them. The Germans distrust the Chinese and us as much. Everybody correctly distrusts everybody else. So anybody who has the capability to develop their own security-related technologies is going to do so, I think. But it doesn't mean that everything will be completely decoupled, because everything that's below the security level of threshold, like just assembling parts for electronic equipment, that would enter into the same zone as all other kinds of manufacturing, which would range from automobiles to, you know, athletic shoes and so forth and so on, which is private enterprise. And the government, the US government's control over private enterprise is limited. It exists to a degree, but it's limited. And those will be predominantly business decisions. And the business decisions are going to be complicated. As you know, the cost of labor is rising in China.
Yes.
There are certain supply chains that we understand are important, like PPE. What is PPE? You know, personal protective equipment, masks, and so on. Certain pharmaceutical supply chains, there will be a degree of decoupling from those because they're also strategic. But I think that when it comes to the huge amount of investment and trade in ordinary consumer products and ordinary raw materials, decoupling would be so complicated and so costly, and there's a lack of other sources of some of this stuff at the same level of quantity and quality, that I don't think that a complete, you know, in the old Cold War, there was total decoupling. There was virtually no trade at all between the two camps. I don't see that happening.
Thank you, Andrew.
Maybe we can go now. We mentioned Taiwan. You said China feels that its security is threatened. Mm-hmm. Is that behind the political and military pressure on Taiwan that we've seen recently? They crossed the Taiwan Strait several times, conducted military exercises, stockpiled on their intermediate range missiles. They have also bullied other countries like Japan over the Senkaku Islands, Philippines, Vietnam, and of course India, due to the Himalayan confrontations there. Mm-hmm. So what is China after with regards its policy on Taiwan? Is this part of a broader strategy to feel, you know, to increase their security, or it's a way to confront the US? Or maybe have Xi portray himself as a new Mao? And Juan Pablo Toro here from Athena Lab asks if you think the US is willing to defend the island, what that implies in case of an attack or an invasion or a more aggressive stance.
So when the People's Republic of China came into existence in 1949, it had territorial disputes with all of its neighbors. At land and at sea, just because of the history, you know, that it had been a very weak country, that many of those borders had never been demarcated. Clearly, there had been a lot of treaties that China didn't accept and so on. It has settled almost all of those border disputes. China doesn't mind settling border disputes under, you know, when it's ready to do so. But there are certain border disputes that remain that are very important to China and to the other party that's involved, and those have been difficult to settle. You mentioned India. There are three such disputes along the border of India. There's Vietnam. But let's talk about Taiwan. Taiwan is not a border dispute, as a matter of fact. There's actually no sovereignty dispute over Taiwan. No country, well, Taiwan does not claim to be, and it has not declared independence. It calls itself the Republic of China. And no country recognizes Taiwan as an independent country from China. There are 20 or so countries that recognize Taiwan as China, and they don't recognize the People's Republic of China. So it's not a border dispute. It's not really a sovereignty dispute. The issue is that China doesn't exercise control over Taiwan's actions, and fears that Taiwan will declare itself to be an independent country. So a lot of my friends in the United States say, so what? That's okay. The Taiwanese are different and they want to be independent, democratic, so who cares? But from Beijing's point of view, and this is finally, I'm getting to directly answer your question. From Beijing's point of view, the lack of control over Taiwan represents a very, very severe threat to China's security. This is a large island, 100 miles, 90 nautical miles off the coast of China. It's very close to China. The United States has, in the past, used it as a base to launch military action around Taiwan. We still have a substantial military, we don't have a military alliance with Taiwan now, but we have a military mission there. We sell weapons there. We do training there. We consult with Taiwan over military strategy. And as you pointed out, we claim to guarantee that we would participate in preventing China from exercising military control over Taiwan unless Taiwan agrees to it, the so-called peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. So it's a base close to the mainland of China that can be used to threaten China militarily, to attack China, to prevent Chinese ships from exiting the China coast and going into the Pacific Ocean. It's also a political base for subversion, potentially, of China. So China feels that I have to control it. And why shouldn't I? Because I own it. It was mine under international law. Why would I give it up? So it is very important to China, and they have no reason whatsoever to sort of give up on it. And if they were to say, "Oh, the Taiwanese are good people; they would never hurt us. We'll just let them be independent because it doesn't threaten our security," that wouldn't make any sense, because the Taiwanese, the residents of Taiwan, I'm using the term Taiwanese, they are not particularly friendly to mainland China. So that doesn't make sense either. Now, so that, I think that answers the first part of your question, is what is it, what is China up to in Taiwan? And the answer is they must control Taiwan, or it is a permanent threat to their security forever. Second question, what will the US do? Well, it kind of depends on what China itself does. So the Chinese strategy is to never give up the military threat and to actually build up the military threat so that the people in Taiwan can see that that threat is there, but not to use it, but to use economic integration, diplomatic pressure, political pressure to peacefully resolve the Taiwan issue. And a key element of this peaceful resolution strategy lies in Washington, D.C. That is to say, if Beijing can persuade the United States that, hey, you really have no good military option. So let me get a little bit into the military thing. The American posture in the Asia Pacific is complicated, but for Taiwan, it relies heavily on aircraft carriers. China now has the capability to sink an American aircraft carrier. Not 100% sure of it, but they probably can. You have about 7,000 American personnel on an aircraft carrier. just from that part of the picture alone, you can imagine, is the United States really going to use that aircraft carrier and take the risk of sinking 7,000 sailors and airmen? So the Chinese strategy is to scare the US so that it doesn't, so that the American deterrence commitment loses its credibility, and to scare the people in Taiwan, and also to get the Taiwan economically linked up with mainland China. So that's their strategy. And it seems to succeed in preventing Taiwan from declaring independence, but not succeeding so far in persuading the Taiwanese residents that, okay, let's just go ahead and unify with mainland China because, we don't have any other good option. So it's partly successful so far. What would China do militarily so Taiwan is not going to declare independence, and for that reason, China's not going to attack militarily. And that's the situation now. But if China did attack militarily, it is very unclear whether the United States would really intervene because of the reason that I already said. The cost would be tremendous.
Andrew, you warned that there is a distrust between China and United States, but at the same time, in your article, you said that China's cooperation is necessary to deal with global challenges like climate change, future pandemics, terrorism. What, in your opinion, what would be the conditions to attain this selective cooperation between United States and China, given this distrust, this confrontation, and so on?
So I think if Trump is elected, it's really impossible to build up that trust because Trump is simply too untrustworthy. Nobody knows who to speak to in Washington to have any agreement. But I think in a more normal American administration, the way that you would build up trust, I think, is to have very frank, honest conversations between the two sides in which the American side would say, look, we view you as a rival. We do intend to compete with you militarily. We are revising our military posture in the Asia Pacific in such a way as to confront you more effectively. We have these areas of conflict and we're going to pursue them, but at the same time, we need to work together on other areas. The Chinese are very much capable of that kind of separation of issue areas. They often advocate, as a matter of fact, that, for example, economics and politics should not be confused together. And so I think you just have to tell the Chinese that, look, because tell them, that they know and that this is an area where cooperation is necessary, and this is what we're prepared to do, and this is what that kind of discussion in which it doesn't mean that they trust the United States across the board or believe that the United States is a friendly power. That the Chinese they're not going to believe that. What they can trust is that potentially is that the United States is committed, in fact, to certain areas of cooperation out of self-interest, that we have a clear view of our own self-interest. At the present time, the Trump administration doesn't have a clear view of American self-interest, even with respect to climate change or with respect to trade. So an example of that is Trump's trade war. Trump's trade war basically is stupid. And the Chinese know that it's stupid, and still they see Trump doing it. So they their analysis is this guy doesn't even understand his own self-interest. So how can we deal with him? So, you know, you have to get over that. You have to be rational.
I have a great question here from Ambassador Alfredo. He says he quotes last Pew Research survey, which signaled a considerably increase in the levels of distrust for both China and Xi Jinping, 85% in Sweden, 86% in Japan. On the other hand, the State of Southeast Asia survey indicated high levels of concern in neighboring countries with regards to China increasing displays of military muscle in the South China Sea. Do you think China cares about this? I must also say that, as opposed to the Pew Research, levels of admiration for China and Chile are very high. As per Academ survey, 66% of Chileans think and admire China, which is rather different from what the other countries surrounding China think.
Yeah. So I've already said quite a bit about why the image of China in the United States is quite negative, and I've sort of said a little bit about Europe, but I hadn't said anything about Southeast Asia. But I think that this suspicion of China in Southeast Asia really fits into my argument that China doesn't have any natural friends. Why is that? It seems so unfortunate to Chinese friends of mine. You know, they feel like, hey, we're a good country. We're growing our economy. We're not hurting anybody. Why do you hate us? But the Southeast Asians are very suspicious because China is a gigantic country right near them, and each Southeast Asian country wants its autonomy, its independence. It doesn't want to be pushed around. The Americans are far away, and the Americans have been relatively, well, it's a long, complicated story, but the Southeast Asians want a balance between China and the United States. That's A. B, the Southeast Asian countries are not, quote unquote, ethnically Chinese, except for Singapore. And so there's an ethnic suspicion. And C, there are a lot of ethnic Chinese living in Southeast Asia. And so the non-Chinese populations, the Malay populations and so on, there's a whole ethnic dimension. So China's not surrounded by friends, and that's true if you look at India, if you look at Russia, if you look at Japan or Korea, that none of these countries is automatically friendly to China. Chile is different because Chile is far away from China and doesn't, feel that kind of a threat, and the relationship has got a lot more positives in it and not too many negatives, so you're in a different place in the world. But does China care is really the question. And I think that China does care a lot and believes that, and since around 2005 or so, for the last 15 or 20 years, China has invested a tremendous amount in what they call telling the China story well, which we would call propaganda probably. And they've done it with media, and they've done it with educational exchanges and training programs and so on and so forth. And they want to get out the picture that they say that a common destiny of mankind, a win-win relationship. China respects human rights. China is interested in not interfering in your politics and so forth. So the telling the China story well has a bunch of themes that Chinese spokespeople and media and so forth promote. And they invest a lot in this, the Confucius Institutes, for example. So I think they do care. It's an interesting question why it is so hard in many countries, not Chile maybe, but in many other countries, why it is so hard to really um, make people like China. I think a big piece of it is the Chinese political system. It is a dictatorship. It does violate human rights. That makes for a bad image. And I think another part of it is a kind of racism against Chinese on the part of persons of other racial groups. But I think the political system is a big part. And Xi Jinping's own image, his personal image, is not very good in most parts of the world because he really comes across as somebody who's very stiff, scripted, and is doing bad things. So it's a tough job to sell the China story.
Jorge?
Uh, eh, Andrew, in the audience, Sebastian Lem asked the following. Which are the Chinese foreign policy? You have explained about the Chinese influence and expansion, strategy and objectives for a UN reform, IMF, World Bank, and other international agreed systems, considering that China is a permanent member of the Security Council of the UN. What is the strategy of the Chinese expansion in the multilateral domain?
Yeah, well, I think it's important that China doesn't oppose any of these institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Telecommunications Union, Interpol, WHO. It's not against any of them. It is in favor of them. Particularly for example, in the UN, China views the Security Council as a place where it can exert some limitation on American unilateralism. So from the Chinese point of view, the Americans decide they want to bomb this country or bomb that country, and they just go off and bomb it. But if the United States comes to the Security Council and wants a Security Council resolution for an intervention someplace, China has a voice, and it can try to limit what the United States does. So this, for China, this is a great thing. And I'm not aware that China has proposed any reform, any basic reform in the UN. In terms of the other agencies that I mentioned, what they want is more influence. They want a bigger voting role in the World Bank. They got a bigger voting role in the IMF. Their person is the head of the WHO, or was the head of the WHO, not now. The one before was a person from Hong Kong. Their person is the head of the International Telecommunications Union. Their previous head of Interpol was a Chinese guy. They just got elected to the UN Human Rights Council. Their strategy is to get well, they're already in, but their strategy is to be in these UN institutions and get higher positions, in many cases, the directorship of those institutions, and to make those institutions perform in the interests of China, which depends on, that's very, very complicated as to what each of these institutions can do for China. So you could almost say that China is more of a defender of the UN system than the United States is. They're active in the peacekeeping operations department of the United Nations. They pay their dues. The US doesn't do so.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the US? And there's a comment here. First, that Xi changed the constitution to eliminate term limits. Isn't this a way to become a dictator? That's a question from Cristiana Izaguirre. But I'll add to that the Trump question. You said that there were differences inside the administration. Maybe you can explain what are those differences. And in your paper, you talk about the strategy of Trump administration of placing the topics over human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in the public harangues uh, against China. Is this, I would think, cynical, to say the least, considering Trump's own behavior on these issues and the fact that other strong allies like Saudi Arabia, for example, are not really clean on these topics?
So on the first question about the revision of the Constitution, yes, the Xi Jinping occupies three key positions simultaneously. He is the president of the state or the government. He is the chairman, the general secretary of the ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, and he is the chairperson of the Central Military Commission. So between these three positions, he controls everything. Only the state constitution had term limits. The other two positions don't have term limits to begin with, but usually in the past, at least, those three positions have gone together. So he did have the Constitution amended to get rid of term limits for the state presidency, and that does allow him, he's now in his second term, but it would allow him to be re-elected as many times as he wants. Nobody knows whether he, is going to want to serve forever or just for a third or fourth term. And that is absolutely a step in consolidating what in any case was a dictatorship. So your questioner said, does that make him a dictator? Well, he was already a dictator, but this eliminated one, sort of small obstacle to his being a dictator. Certainly sent a signal to anybody inside the power structure of China that, I am a dictator and I intend to be a dictator, and I'm not going to leave power until I'm ready. Now, in the Trump administration, the factions, I guess you could divide it into four factions. So the last one is Trump himself. But one faction was a group of people who believe that we shouldn't blow up the China relationship because there's a huge amount of money to be made in China, investing and and so on. And people called them the Wall Street faction. And that was, for example, Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Jared Kushner, the senior advisor to the president, are people who are business people, and there are a lot of wealthy Trump supporters out in the Wall Street area and the venture capital area and so forth who think, let's keep a smooth relationship and so we can make money. Those people have lost influence. Then there is the people around Pompeo, including Peter Navarro, the trade advisor, who see China as this existential threat to Western Christian civilization. Then there are some policymakers in the administration who are kind of security, I would say, technicians. I'm thinking here of the Deputy National Security Advisor, who's a guy named Matt Pottinger, whose concern is much more practical and down to earth with things like Chinese pressure on U.S. citizens of Chinese extraction or Uyghur background from Xinjiang, that kind of thing, Chinese agents operating in the United States, reciprocity where Chinese media have a lot of offices here with spies in them, and we don't have the same privilege in China, things like that. So he's down in the weeds working on this security relationship. And then I would say Trump is the fourth faction who thinks it's all about the trade deficit, and Xi Jinping and I can talk because I'm charming, and so on. He has this sort of crazy policy. Now, on the third question about cynicism, I agree with the questioner. It particularly relates to the Pompeo faction, who say that China's threatening Western values of human rights, democracy, and rule of law, when, as the questioner points out, and of course, this is not just in the Trump administration. This has been a feature of American policy, and Chile knows this better than anybody, right? That you could call it, cynicism implies that the American side doesn't believe in human rights, democracy, and rule of law. It's not quite that. They believe in it, but then they're always willing to sacrifice it in exchange for some other, in fact, they wouldn't even regard it as a sacrifice. So I think when they're dealing, say, with Saudi Arabia, these people think in order to defend human rights and democracy and rule of law, we've got to work through the existing power structure in Saudi Arabia so that we can defend Israel and defeat Iran and terrorism. And so they think of it as a complicated world in which their goal remains human rights, democracy, and rule of law. But I'm talking about them, not me. From my point of view, I agree with the questioner that this behavior by the United States is very inconsistent and undercuts the credibility of our declared commitment to things like rule of law. For example, in the South China Sea, to sort of switch over in the South China Sea, the United States calls upon China to obey the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we have not ratified ourselves. So it is very inconsistent.
I'll add a follow-up on that before turning it over to Jorge. But there's a lot of questions about Biden. Well, hopefully there's 20 days to go. We'll have a change. What will the change be, in your opinion, with regards to China in an eventual Biden presidency?
Well, I already said something about that, so I'm not sure what the questioner wants beyond what I already said. But I mean, I think Biden will continue to view China as a peer competitor or as a strategic competitor, but he will he'll be much more consistent than the Trump administration has been and be more strategic and work with allies. And I do think Biden will continue to emphasize rule of law and human rights and democracy with somewhat less cynicism, not completely none, but somewhat less, more consistency around that, because it is, after all, rule of law. So if we divide these things up, rule of law is a very attractive solution for managing international affairs, I think. And we can advocate that with considerable conviction. Human rights is more of a sort of, religious faith, but it is something that I think most American policymakers believe in. And feel that it would make the world safer for us if other countries obeyed, had better human rights. So I think Biden will push that. And I would emphasize again the multilateralism part. But, the United States still we cannot compete with China, for example, in investment money overseas. We're not going to be able to. We're not going to be able to quickly change our military posture in a way that effectively counters the Chinese buildup in the Pacific. So it's not going to be a black and white change in policy, I think. It'll be just a more professional, consistent policy that seeks to prevent China from expanding its power so much. If Trump wins, I think it's good for China because Trump is weakening the United States politically and morally and economically and in so many ways, and it creates kind of a vacuum. So even if, say, the Southeast Asian countries don't really like China, if the United States has no effective presence there, they will have to accommodate.
Andrew, you said that the Chinese influence is based, among other things, on the economic power, the wealth, the One Belt, One Road initiative as a masterpiece of its expansion, and the more engagement in global institutions. But at the same time, we know that the Chinese economy is rebalancing or shifting from an export investment economy based to a more a focus on domestic demand. They has called that the dual circulation strategy, the past made in China. How do you envision for the future this, on the one hand, Belt and Road Initiative, economic expansion, but on the other hand, this inward looking on the Chinese economy? What will be the impact, the effects on diplomacy, on politics, on global expansion?
Ah, that's such a complicated question. I mean, I think the simple answer is that the effort to build up the domestic consumption demand, China has too much production and not enough demand globally. Yes. And one way to understand the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's an effort to export demand. In other words, what they're sending overseas is Chinese steel and concrete and engineers and workers and so on. So they're trying to keep their domestic industries going by exporting demand to other countries, to Pakistan and stuff like that. That's one aspect. That's not the whole story, but that's one way to understand it. And so it's for about 20 years or so, they've been saying we can't rely on exports alone to soak up all of the stuff that we produce. We have to build up domestic demand, and they've been doing that. So they've raised the incomes of peasants and so on, and have been building up domestic demand. They've created a health insurance system, an unemployment system, and all kinds of social welfare systems that serve to increase domestic demand. So I don't see, they announce a new dual circulation policy, but I don't think it means a kind of dramatic shift in China's relationship to the global economy. It's part of a trend that's been going on for a long time. And we should understand as well that the Chinese economy faces all kinds of threats. What they're trying to do now may or may not succeed. I'm not counting on it to fail, really, but it's not easy to build up. So the short answer to this question is I don't think that the dual circulation policy is going to lead to any dramatic change in China's overseas economic relationship. The BRI will continue. China's export drive will continue. Despite Trump's trade war, China's exports have not really suffered in the aggregate. They continue to be a huge exporter. And as I said before, there's always going to be some change as certain products become cheaper to produce in Bangladesh or in Vietnam or someplace. Manufacturers will gradually move there, but you can't replace all of China as a producer because they have such a huge population, very sophisticated engineers, good ports and transportation and so forth. They're not, 100 years from now, things may be different, but in the foreseeable future, China will continue to be a huge exporter. That's my assessment anyway.
Fortunately, we ran out of time. I just, before closing up, want to ask you, I know it's not about US-China, but it's about the US, your take on the elections. Mm-hmm. And with that, we will close and thank Jorge and thank the center in Rio, our Columbia Global Center in Rio. As I said, this is the first of a series of conversations. I think we're hosting Ambassador Westphal, Jorge, to speak on the Middle East in a few weeks.
Yes.
So I want to thank everybody. We had more than 300 people participating in the webinar, which is a record for us. And Andy, before closing, your take, we're very much looking forward to November 3rd. Some with hope, some of us with hope. What's your take?
I'm so anxious. I can hardly sleep. Everybody that I know is extremely anxious about it. As you know everything I know, Biden is leading in the polls. There's a tremendous effort on both sides to get out their voters. Nobody's changing their mind. It's just mobilizing the two bases. Trump's allies are trying to call into Trump himself is calling it. There's a lot of mail-in ballots. It will take more time to count them. Trump is indicating that he may, if he loses, contest the election. It might go to the Supreme Court. We're having hearings right now for this new justice for the Supreme Court. So it's going to be one or more sleepless nights as we wait for but however, and I must say, as I always tell people, say to me, what do you do? I say, I teach political science. And then they say, oh, what about the election? I don't know. I'm a specialist in China. China is easy to understand. China, we know who's in control. China, we know who's going to be the successor we could in power. I don't understand American politics at all. I've never understood it. I usually predict it wrong. So.
Well, let's hope that all predictions and all polls and all hopes do actually happen, and that will have an important change, which will definitely have impact on the U.S.-China relationship and on the U.S. relationship with every region in the world. Right. Andy, thanks so much again for agreeing to speak with us. It's been an honor. Jorge, thanks. Tom, Trevat from Rio, thanks a lot. And thanks for all of you who participated. We had tons of questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. So we'll have the opportunity to talk about the Middle East very soon. Thank you very much.